Hi and welcome to the Digital Accessibility Podcast sponsored by PCR Digital, who provide people-centric recruitment. Throughout this series, I'll be interviewing professionals who work within the field of accessibility to share their expertise, journeys and general thoughts on the key issues facing the industry today. My aim is to provide an in-depth look into the world of digital accessibility and the impact it has on everyone. The goal is to bridge the skills gap in the current market and inspire other people to join the movement towards a more accessible digital world. So whether you're a seasoned professional or just starting out, I hope that this platform will provide you with valuable insights and practical advice from experts and advocates within this extremely important community. So sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy the chat. Today, I'm joined by Shaun Conner, who is Accessibility and Inclusion Strategy Manager at Monzo Bank, the bank that lives on your phone, who are on a mission to make money work for everyone. Shaun has also worked as an accessibility lead for the HMRC and spent 11 years within development and leadership for the NHS. He's an excellent keynote speaker, experienced front-end developer, specializing in web accessibility, digital inclusion, and accessibility standards. Welcome to the podcast, Shaun.
Thank you very much. That's a very flattering. When you read it like that, it sounds like I've done loads, but I promise you, it's not that impressive.
Well, 11 years working through the ranks at nearly 12 years working through the ranks at the NHS. I think that's impressive that'd be impressive to most people. No one can tell you're not loyal or committed to the cause, right?
Well, that's it, and it's weird when you're in a place like that because you almost become a little bit institutionalized. And then when I was looking for like a new job, I realized actually the world outside of this, there's like much higher paying jobs for this line of work. So
There you go.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff. But then, so I guess, obviously being the digital accessibility podcast, the first question I was going to ask you is if you can tell us a bit about your first experience with digital accessibility, and if it was a passion from day one. You get a lot of passionate people in the space, or if it's something that took you some time to sink in, because I know that, like I said, your background's in the sort of development and technical kind of space.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and when so while I was working at the NHS, I went to there was a conference, and I think it was called Future Gov. If you've heard of that, they were like a really good conference, and it wasn't an accessibility conference, but one of the speakers who was there was called Kat Macaulay, and Kat was head of design at the Scottish government, and she was a very sweary Glaswegian who was just fed up. She was disabled as well, and she talked very passionately about first of all, it was around like physical barriers and accessible toilets and hotel rooms, and then she sort of transitioned into the digital side of it, and just talking about how really there's no need for any of this stuff to be inaccessible because we have the technology now to make things fully accessible. So I was sat at this conference and I just remember sitting there so inspired by like the talk, and she was effing and blinding, and it was very like right down my street. And I remember thinking in the moment when she was talking, I'm like, well, I'm a front end developer, like I can fix almost everything that she's talking about here, and I know how to do that. So I met Kat after the talk and I was speaking to her for a little while, and I'm like, listen, that has just lit a fire under me, because I can take what you've experienced and start to fix some of this stuff. So I came away from that conference, and at the time, I had a small team of front end developers, and I was sort of advocating for it. And then in 2018, the public sector accessibility regs came in, so it was like, all right, okay, I know all this stuff, but now we legally have to do it. So it almost by accident became my job. And because, I was inspired by Kat and started running accessibility talks at the NHS, and then with the public sector regs, when all that stuff come in, it was like, right, well, I get to do this as part of my job now. So went on after that to lead like the full remediation piece at the NHS, so there was a lot of things that we needed to fix. We had to put accessibility statements on like literally hundreds of services. The second part of that was like going and fixing some of the stuff, so it meant upskilling some of the team, and suddenly I found myself in a sort of accessibility leadership role, and I enjoyed it at the NHS, but it wasn't very mature as a process.
Right.
It didn't really have the top down support that it needed, which ultimately meant that I left and joined HMRC, where, as you say, I was a accessibility lead there. So much sort of better setup there. Was one of the bigger accessibility teams in government. And I led the audit and assurance team. So my team was like 7 people. Then there was, I think, the same on another team around compliance and governance. And then there was more people and contractors and stuff. So it was a breath of fresh air when I went there, and it was like actually these folks know what they're doing with this stuff. And then obviously now I've joined Monzo to focus on strategy. So
Yeah.
it became a passion, I suppose, to answer your question. Like, and as soon as like this industry, there's people slam doors in your face all day, every day, and I'm a very stubborn person, and I just think, you know what, keep slamming the doors, I'll keep opening them again, and it was sort of a match for my personality, I suppose.
I think it's funny you say that, because obviously being a recruiter, you can imagine the stigma behind recruiters constantly banging on people's doors and getting the doors slammed in their face. Maybe I'm just glutton for punishment. Recruiter in accessibility.
Well,
Like, oof.
but well, I know you get a double whammy. But it's funny because I was talking to Jamie, a friend of mine who also works in accessibility, and we come up with this analogy about like our jobs as accessibility professionals is almost to become those like metal things that you put on doors that stop doors from slamming, and then eventually people stop trying to slam the door because they just think, well, this is pointless, it's just going to slowly shut. So yeah, like I live and breathe this stuff now, and it's for the past 8 years, it's all I've done, and like it's we've came a long way, and it's good to see the progress, but there's just still so much to do.
Absolutely. And I think you'll find that, hopefully not, but most people I've spoken to that have been in the space for 20 odd years, and they're just like, yeah, we've seen progress, but there's still so much to do. And it's I think it's always going to be the case. There's no full stop, I don't think, because tech's always going to keep changing. People's needs are going to keep evolving. So I think it's more, as we keep saying on this podcast, it's about the mindset and getting people sort of engaged with it and understand that there is an ever evolving need for people that focus on this stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's and I feel sorry for anyone who's been doing it for 20 years, still telling people to add alt text to images. But yeah, I suppose you just have to be a certain type of person to just keep on keeping on with it. Which is why you find a lot of passionate people like who do this line of work, because it's like, right, well, it's the right thing to do. We'll just keep shouting about it.
Yeah, and it's horrible because the first word that came into my mind, going to coin a phrase from Craig Abbott, who I know you know personally as well. When he was on the podcast, he said the unfortunate thing is when I'm looking for people to work in accessibility, the first word that came to mind was resilience. And then when you think about these people that have been in the space for 20 odd, even yourself, 8+ years, it's it does go hand in hand, unfortunately. I think it's like, yeah, you've got to be resilient. You've just got to keep on keeping on, keep banging down those doors.
You do, and it's I remember I listened to Craig's podcast. I thought it was brilliant, by the way. And Craig talking about resilience, like if for me, you can be the most resilient person in the world, and eventually, like it's going to get on top of you. So, and I think that's where all the burnout stuff comes from, right? That like we want to keep on keeping on, and it just gets too much. So, yeah.
Interesting stuff. This isn't a question I've already posed to you, Shaun, so I'm apologizing. I'm going to add another one in there. But it sounds like you almost got a bit of a lucky head start with attending that FutureGov talk, hearing CAP talk, and then going back to the NHS where you said it wasn't very mature, there wasn't the support top down. So your inroads to accessibility probably helped the NHS on their way to becoming a bit more sort of focused in that area. So I guess by the time you left, did you feel that maturity was starting to grow, or?
Definitely. So, while I was there, off the back of the remediation project, we implemented certain things. So there was like things had to be signed off before they went into production, around the technical compliance of stuff, and it was it was getting there. But I think the problem at the NHS was nobody wanted to own accessibility. Like it just was this sort of hot potato that would land in somebody else's lap, and then they would be like, absolutely not, I'm not having any of this, and then it would get passed to the next person. And when you're trying, especially from a lead position, to like shout up about accessibility and they're not shouting down, then you're on like a certain path to failure with
Yeah.
this stuff. And I did burn out very quickly at the end of that, because I'm like, I'm fine to keep shouting about it, but I need other people to at least have my back.
Yeah.
And like I spoke about this at a conference that I was at in Sweden a few weeks ago, and I was just saying I could probably find an old NHS service that we fixed, and we published an accessibility statement on to say like, right, we'll fix this by, I don't know, September 2019, and that statement won't have been updated. So as much
Wow.
as we've done the work up front, it didn't have what it needed to continue and start assuring some of this stuff. So it might be better now. I mean, that was a few years ago, but certainly when I left, it was I was disappointed, and I sort of took some of the responsibility for that, because I'm like, well, I'm the one who's trying to drive this, but like anybody who's worked in this line of work will know that you need buy-in for this stuff. Like it doesn't just happen like with one person, certainly not.
Yeah, I was going to say you can't fight. It's trying to win a war with a one-man army. Like you just can't take that on. No amount of resilience is going to help you win that battle, unfortunately. But great that you started them on that path. So that's all good. So the next part, I believe that you were part of the team that worked to get the DDAT accessibility specialist role description together when you were at the HMRC. And a couple of weeks ago, I was at Accessibility Scotland, and Beverly Newing was talking about that, and so I know that you've worked alongside and things as well. So just wanted to know a bit more from my perspective as a recruiter, why that was important for you to get something together, and why it was so hard to actually implement that in public sector.
Yeah. Shout out to Bev, by the way. She is a lovely human. I've been talking to her actually over the last couple of days, coincidentally. But yeah, so around the accessibility specialist, that was led actually by David Caldwell and Beverly. So they sort of spearhead that, and I was part of the focus group. So the focus group was made up of like different government departments, and why this was so important was because, and I've seen this everywhere I've worked, like everybody approaches accessibility in different ways, which is fine. There's no right or wrong way to do it. And we're all still trying to figure this out, especially off the back of the public sector accessibility regulations.
Yeah.
So we had to come up with some sort of job description that would work for more or less everybody. So I was part of one of the bigger accessibility teams. So there was two of us who went, myself and Wojciech. So Wojciech was part of the governance side of it, and I would lead the auditing team. And then you had people, I think we had somebody from Department of for Education, Kev was there, who ran Accessibility Scotland, so he was part of it. There was like quite a few over, and it was good because it just meant that we could come to like a general consensus of what we thought this role should look like. And of course it was important because like everybody, we had teams who like we legally have to do this now. So just like you would have a front end developer, the idea was that we would have an accessibility specialist, and it was a route in to accessibility, which was good, and then it was also a route for people to progress within the profession as well, which was just as important. And it was an interesting project. Like I think at one point the job description was very much looking like a front end developer. So there was a lot of back and forth around like what should this role look like, and as much as I would say the technical skills are important, like my view on it is that we should have more user researchers, content designers, like varied experience in there. Like it doesn't really always have to rely on just being a technical person.
Yeah.
So getting that balance right was really important, and we got a first version of it out, and I think that's worth pointing out as well, that what you see on the accessibility specialism was meant to be taken by departments and add to it or create your own roles off the back of it. It was just like a structure really for teams to recruit.
Brilliant.
But it was just amazing to get that added to the DDAF framework, because it just added credibility to the profession. which, we spend a lot of time shouting about why we need accessibility specialists. And now to be part of that DDAP framework was, it's a massive success, and probably one of the things I'm most proud of in my career is being part of that group to get that done. I mean, I think I was looking at the governance side of it, which was probably the most boring side of it, but we got it done. And I just think, to collaborate across many different departments as well and come to an agreement was like a massive success for everyone involved. So I'm excited to see over the next couple of years how that changes and how we improve it over time.
I think it's also, from my perspective, obviously job specs and job descriptions, they're a daily occurrence for me. And we actually spoke pre-recording about certain job specs, and especially in the private sector, how convoluted and complicated and daunting they can be. Because even if you have half the skills that they've listed, because they're not really sure they know what they're asking for, it can put so many applicants off. It can make a lot of people think, I don't think that's quite right for me, or that may be that I'm biting off more than I can chew. I think that's a team of people, not just, I can't go in there and do that, especially for the salary they're offering, So I think to get that in the public sector, we definitely need to try and start pushing that into the private as well, and just being like, right, take that by example and just say, right, okay, well, we need to set some edges. If you set those boundaries and be like, right, these are the key elements that people should and will need to have to be successful in the role, then people feel more comfortable applying. They'll feel, yeah, that's an achievable role. I'm going to gain something from it. I can progress within that, rather than, oh my God, I'm burnt out just reading the spec before I even start, So
yeah.
it's I think, what an amazing achievement. And you were part of the accessibility X-Men or Avengers, great group of people.
Well, the people who are far better than now was in that group. I mean, but this was it as well. And it was just, I think what we're starting to see now is like a lot of places will model around like WK, and, particularly around design systems, and like the DDAP framework is very much the same. So private firms will look at what a good team should look like. So the fact that, accessibility is now part of that. And then, of course, you've got the European Accessibility Act coming in 2025, which you would, the cynical side of me thinks, well, nobody's going to listen to that and they'll just pretend it hasn't happened. But what realistically should happen, and what I would hope would happen, is that firms then go, actually, we need like an accessibility team because we have to do this legally now. So we'll see how that unfolds. But really, really solid group of people who done that, and it landed pretty well as well. So we only had 5 or 6 departments like involved in actually doing that, and of course government is massive, so there was a risk that we sort of put it out there to get other people's opinions, and they were like, oh my God, you've got this all wrong. But we kept it quite high level, and I think that's why it worked.
Brilliant.
So yeah,
I think that, it's, if you can, I know it's not a simple job to describe or explain, and because there are so many moving parts and different areas of focus within accessibility, digital accessibility, or physical or social, but it's a big job that needed to be done. So it's great that you were part of that, like you say. And as I mentioned in the intro, you have quite a heavy development and technical background. I know you're less so sort of hands-on tech at the minute, but you like to keep up with things. I actually saw you posted not too long ago about Daniel Dirksen Starts from Spotify, the iOS engineer who wrote Writing Accessible iOS Applications. So he's a guy that I'd love to have on the podcast, and we're working at it. So I know that you're keeping up to date with stuff, but I think that there's a bit of a misconception that tech and development is the hotspot. That's where digital accessibility responsibility lies. That's a tongue twister. The responsibility lies with technical or development teams. But do you agree, as a leader in the space, that that's where it should lie, or what do you think needs to be done to kind of share and split that responsibility out?
Yeah, it's so that is a real misconception, and my position on it is that accessibility is everybody's responsibility. Most people don't know that, so I think a big part of what I do is educating people around the role that they can play, and ensuring that they're embedding accessibility at the right times. So that could be product managers, delivery managers, designers, developers, testers, content, like, across the spectrum of the product, and even outside of the product as well. Like, um, one of the bits that I did at Monzo was like training our customer service representatives how to speak to disabled people, like, and so everybody has got a role to play in this. And I suppose that as a developer, like, yes, I could fix a lot of this stuff, but also, like, developers try to be smart and developers break more than they fix. So
Yeah.
I'm throwing shade on developers here, but I would, it was me who would have to go in and often fix some of this stuff. So but again, it's an education piece. And I think, like, one of the things that we did at HMRC, so, the GovUK design system is arguably one of the most accessible, best built design systems that there is. But we were finding that teams were making the same mistakes over and over and over again. So, what we did was we would log all of our accessibility issues in Jira, not Jira, sorry, in GitHub. And what that meant that we could do is we could hit the GitHub API and look at all of the audits that we've ever done, and pull them down by tag. And we could create this nice little front end that said, the most failed thing was something like error messages or inputs. And we got all of this amazing data where we could go back and say, well, actually, like, we need to do a session with the content designers because we're not doing very well with our error messages. Or we would have to go to our developers and say, you keep breaking radio buttons. Like, can we teach you how to do this properly?
Yeah.
So again, it's doing it within the context of like what are the real problems here. And I think taking an approach like that, like, it helps teams understand as well, like, oh, actually, this is my responsibility, and doing things like role-based training. But again, like, it has to be, you have to have a top-down approach to this. And like, one of the mistakes I made early on in my career was I tried to sort of embed accessibility into teams. So I would go to a team and say, like, right, this is your job, and we would do all this interesting, you'd spend all this time training the team, and then 2 weeks later they would leave and somebody else would come in, and it was like, oh, actually, hang on, I'm doing this the wrong way here. So then I rolled it up a level and be like, well, actually, why don't we just embed into practice? So, rather than hit individual teams, start getting in amongst communities of practice. So 1 week we would go and sit in front of the automation testers, or the next week it would be designers. And this is still something I do at Monzo now. Like, I would much rather do it that way, and then you increase your reach as well. And you can start measuring, are you still seeing the same fails off the back of it? So, but ultimately, like, it's all about your users. And for me, it has to start with research. Like, if we want research and before it even kicks off, then you're almost setting yourself up to fail. Like, you would have heard this time and time again, but it's, and from my experience, it's accessibility is always considered too late in the process. Like, what's the absolute earliest opportunity you can get in? That's usually like discovery/research. Like, start from there and build around that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But getting that sort of culture change, especially in somewhere like government, is really challenging. Like, trying to shift the needle. I hate to use like horrible turns of phrases like that, but like, trying to do that at that scale is, Craig talked about this as well. It's very hard to change culture at somewhere that big. And I've been extremely fortunate at Monzo that it's a much smaller company. Like, we've got the culture absolutely down there. Like, I have no problems whatsoever.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think it's having that appetite, isn't it? I think it's tricky to measure that with something as huge as government. But like you say, at Monzo, you can well, I'm not going to say it's easy because I'm not doing your job, Shaun, but you probably start to see that appetite across the board more clearly. And I think it's more of I'd assume Monzo's got a bit more of a startup feel. I mean, obviously, government's been around for God knows. So I think that the appetite's there in the sort of younger companies in the public sector that are sort of on the pulse. They can see that this is needed. They can see that there's benefits to their business as well for implementing accessibility and making sure that their products and services are usable by everyone. But it's interesting because what you were saying on the role-based training and how you sort of try to implement it across teams, it sounds like you're like the one-man band consultant that's like, right, I've got the knowledge, I'm going to try and consult all of these different areas and these different teams, less so taking it all on board, people emailing you as the head of accessibility and fix this for me. I think that's where it lies. It's got to be training, workshops, learning and development, e-learning even, and make it compulsory. But like you said, they'll learn that, and will they implement it? I think you're right. It has to be embedded in the practice and make it standard.
And this is it. And one of the first things that I did when I joined Monzo is like everybody needs training on accessibility. It's non-negotiable. Like, so when you join Monzo, if you join tomorrow, you would get mandatory accessibility training. It would be within the context of your role. So, you learn what you need to know. And I think one of the things about accessibility and what can put people off is like, it's a big beast. Oh my God, I'm going to have to know all this stuff. And actually, like, if you do it within the context of somebody's work, it's like, well, actually, there's not really that much that you have to know. It becomes big when you get it wrong or you leave it too late. But like, and it was interesting as well because when I joined Monzo, the whole time I worked in the public sector, I could count on one hand how many times I was approached about like, oh, tell me more about what you do, like accessibility, like yeah, it's I joined Monzo, and honestly, within the first like 3 days, I was doing training myself. I had like 45 messages from just people all over the bit. Like, and this wasn't just product people. This was like trainers, managers, senior leaders, chief this, like
Oh,
director of
wow.
this, like, and I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh, somebody's put them up to this. Like, surely they can't be that invested in this already. But I think they were just crying out for somebody to come in who like knew this stuff and who had experience of like driving it to be like, right, well, set us up in the right way. Like, what do we need? So,
Oh, brilliant.
um, I've used Craig's, Craig Abbott. His, I don't know whether you've read it, but he's got an article around like an accessibility strategy. I modeled the Monzo strategy around that approach, like, and it works. You're getting your culture right, setting up some level of compliance and educating people as well. So a huge part of what I've done so far is just being around like culture and educating people. And you would think that the compliance side of it takes care of itself after that, but we'll see.
Time will tell, right?
Yeah, I hope. Maybe I'm
Yeah.
still very naive.
No, good. That's brilliant. And I think it is that, isn't it? You're planting the seeds to then help people to grow themselves rather than, just standing over them with a cane. You did that wrong. Like, do it again. I think it's that might work, but we'll try this way first, I think.
And that's it. But like, I think one of the things I've learned over time is that not everyone's going to care about this stuff. Like, you can do all the empathy labs, you can show them stats, you can do, some people just don't care.
Yeah.
And, that, and where I would, where you have to take a different angle, which I don't necessarily like doing, is like talking about risk, like reputational damage. Are you happy to take on that risk then? And the
Yeah.
chances are you start talking about risk and reputational damage. Actually, no, I don't want to do that. So
Yeah.
there are ways around it, and I think that it's just knowing when to use different tactics. Like 90% of people, like nobody builds something trying to make it inaccessible. They just often lack the educate like the knowledge around how to actually do it.
Yeah.
There's very few people, or if anyone, will go out of their way to create something that is inaccessible. So
Definitely.
yeah,
It's quite hard to fathom because I think there's a lot of empathy in the accessibility space to think that there's people that wouldn't give a damn nearly
yeah,
about it is it's hard to sort of get your head around, I suppose. But I know that a huge part of your role is centered around that strategy, roadmap planning and implementation, learning and development, training, workshops. It's a long list. But as burnout's been discussed at length previously, across the whole field of accessibility, I just wanted to know, with your title, so obviously access lead at HMRC, and then you're pretty much, well, head of accessibility at Monzo, with that increased responsibility, that title, how have you managed to juggle that? I guess you've kind of already answered this question, I suppose, just now with the strategy, but
yeah. It's difficult, and I won't say for me, I haven't. spoken to anybody who's got a silver bullet for this stuff. So it's I said to you, I was talking to Bev about this, and I've talked to many other accessibility people who are burned out, and I think we all find ourselves in the same position. So what I've tried to do, and we get into this because we care, and I think that's half of the battle as well. Like when you genuinely care about your work and you're passionate about it, like it can be very deflating. Like, we're talking about the door getting slammed in your face, and like, how many times can you realistically do that before it starts to like impact on your confidence or your mental health? And that's like a huge part of this as well, right? But I think the way I've tried to do it at Monzo is like I've got a roadmap. So, and I would encourage other people to do this as well, because I think too many times like um we just take on too much, and like oh, can I just this, can I just that, and everything's last minute. And so what I've tried to do is like focus on, right, well, this is my roadmap. I've got, let's say, 2 years worth of work. So understand like what you're meant to be working on versus what is business as usual versus what is just being thrown over the wall. And for me, like it's been actually really quite rigid in like, if I've got time, absolutely, I'll help with stuff. And like it's I think Craig touched on this a little bit in his podcast as well, about like we just want to help people, and you don't want to be seen to be turning people away, but also like we have to manage this and manage our own workloads. And like one of the things that I've struggled with, in my current role is like working too many hours. And that's my fault. Like, and that's because like often I'll be like, right, okay, yeah, I'll do the thing. But actually, like, the last couple of months I've just been saying no, and it's hard, and you don't want to turn people away, but actually you need to for the benefit of the work that you're actually meant to be doing. So I'll not explicitly be like, no, I'm not going to talk, I'm not going to help you. But like if there's, a quick something I can send them on Google or whatever, like I'll try and be as light touch as possible with things like that. But like for me as well, it's just learning. A big part of avoiding burnout is like sort of learning to accept that everything's not going to go my way. So, like if you can get comfortable with that and celebrate the small wins, like, take the small wins and celebrate them, shout about them. Like that's what this is about. I think too many people look at the big picture, like, think big and then start big. Well, for me, it's like think big, start small, like, and try and do it that way. Because it is overwhelming, and like so many times, I mean, these teams, like you've spoken to quite a few people now, like accessibility teams tend not to be big teams. There's like 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe it's 5 people. Like the one I had in government was the biggest one. And it still wasn't without its problems. Like there was all sorts going on. um and I think like another way I've tried to do this is just again around the culture. Like, do people care about responsibility, accessibility? Like, make it their responsibility. So use things like when I joined Monzo, I immediately knew like 4 or 5 people from these DMs who were very interested in it. So it's like, right, well, how much of my workload can I share with them? So that's where you have things like champions networks, which they can go a bit stale, but I think if they're done right, like it can be a force multiplier for like the work that you're trying to do.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest mistake I see people doing is just taking too much on and then not being aware that you've took too much on. I think like it's very easy to keep saying yes, and then before you know it, it's like, oh my god, this is like painfully bad. And for me, like I lean a lot of on people in this community. Like I've had phone calls with Craig late at night before, and I've been stressed, and I'll text them now and again saying like, and I'll speak to other people. Jamie, I've got friends who like, the thing is about this community, the accessibility community, is like people genuinely want to help each other, like try and solve similar problems. And I would encourage anybody who's like on that sort of the line of burnout, like if you do want to chat, just drop me a DM. Like, other people will try and help you figure things out. Speak to people, friends, peers, ask for help. One of the things that we did at HMRC to try and avoid burnout was like we had firebreak weeks. So my team, the auditors were front end developers, so they weren't doing any development. They were just testing, and nobody wants to do that. No developer wants to just be testing all day.
No.
So we would have like once every 5-6 weeks, there was an entire week where we would take no audits. It was non-negotiable. The team just had a full week to build cool stuff like, you know, the GitHub front end to see like, you know, and we would work on like passion projects, or they could go and do some self-learning and all that stuff. And it really worked well. It was difficult when we were grinding out audit after audit after audit, but like everybody knew that that little, like the week or 2 weeks,
That was
sometimes it
coming.
was, that we would take a full 2 weeks. And we're all fortunate to do that. And I think like, you know, it's hard, this line of work. Like, you know, I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm always happy about the work that I do. Like, you know, I'm frustrated a lot of the time, and I think that's very normal and acceptable. Like, and just like be kind to yourself. Like, if you feel like you're burning out, take some time off. Like, it is fine to walk away from this for a little while. Like, I've been off on the sick because of this. Like, and that's okay. Like, and you know, it's, I think it's a bigger problem. Well, not a bigger problem. It just is a problem because we care so much, that we are passionate about this, that like, you know, this profession will ruin your mental health if you allow it to. But it's also like the most rewarding job I've ever done, but also the most frustrating.
It's a very strange balance of things, isn't it? That's the thing. I think
It
it's
is.
and looking from the outside in, it is a bit mad. I think there are some people that will go, and it's not that they don't care or they just think, how on earth am I going to make a difference there? You know, but another thing to remember is, like you've said, celebrate the small wins. There's the, you know, the quote that everyone sort of uses in the community: progress, not perfection. You know, I
Yeah.
don't think there's going to be such thing as perfection, because it's not, you know, your product or your tool might be accessible for some, but it might be by nature inaccessible for another group of people. So
Yeah.
it is just constantly thinking about that and taking those steps and small wins. And but
And that you know, the mistake as well that some people would make, and some people being me, like when I first started doing this, like I wanted to fix everything for everybody. I'm like, I can do this at a technical level, I can. And like, you know, we are always going to be excluding somebody. You can create what you think is the most accessible thing, but we're always excluding somebody, and that is just the facts around it. And I think, again, if you just like, you know, I would talk about when I was at HMRC, like it's tax, it's complex language. A lot of it is like policy that can't be changed, and like, you know, rigid rules around like you cannot change the wording and all this stuff. And it creates barriers, you know, by doing it that way. And it's like, well, you know, start doing research with people. Stop focusing on a token blind person to test with a screen reader. Like, who is this particular service going to exclude? And go and do your research with those. So, you know, for tax, it might be people with dyscalculia, people with dyslexia, people with ADHD. Like, those are where you're going to get like the most fruitful like data
yeah,
around accessibility. And I think it's just trying to like shift focus away from compliance and more around like what are the actual barriers that people are facing, and like how do we solve for that.
yeah, absolutely. And that's I mean, like you say, you could have screen readers, switch controls, anything that works with your product. But if it's written in complete technical jargon, then it's, you know, again, you've just completely
Yeah.
excluded such a huge portion of people. Madness. But it's, yeah, we'll touch on everything, I think. But so we've even discussed the recruitment within the space previously on the podcast, and I think we've spoken about it before as well. Very mixed reviews on how it's being done. I've spoken to some people. Obviously, I'm speaking to candidates, people that are looking to get into the space, people that are currently interviewing, and obviously it'd be nice if you had someone that knew accessibility, knew about, you know, what's needed, rewriting job specs, like you said, that was done for the DDAT, and doing that for the private sector. So that's what I'm hoping to be. But so I'm trying to focus on all of that. But do you have any pointers? Do you have any advice for me on how I can better serve the, you know, the general community from a hirer, but also from a candidate perspective? Have you had like people that have supported you in those sort of interview processes before?
Yeah. So I mean, a lot of recruitment processes are just inaccessible and outdated, just purely because of the SaaS, or the software as a service, that they use. So,
Mm.
you know, that is a massive barrier to entry to a lot of people, because they just can't actually apply because the thing isn't accessible to even get an interview.
Yeah.
So that's like the first part of it. But I think like, you know, we talk about reasonable adjustments and interviews and stuff like that. And like my position on it is like, we don't really, they shouldn't be reasonable adjustments. They should just be like how it is. So I don't know, sending out interview questions beforehand, like why is extra time a reasonable adjustment? Like
Yeah.
it isn't really. It should just be standard. Like if you want to get a good answer out of somebody, then give them time. A big one for me is around disclosing the salary. Like too many times I've had recruiters like, oh, we've got this really good job, and we briefly talked about it before we started this, but like
Yeah.
there's so much discrepancy in accessibility salaries. Like, you might get one job that's paying like 70 grand, and you might get the same job description somewhere else is paying 20. And
Yeah.
it's like, well, hang on a second. So, but the reason why I say disclose the salary is because, like, a lot of marginalized groups like end up getting less pay. So, and I think if we keep hiding salaries, then those marginalized groups remain marginalized. So being transparent around that is something that, I'll never apply for a job where they don't do that, because I just think, well,
Yeah.
why waste my time going through all that process just for you to potentially say, oh, well, there's 25 grand. Like, well, no. Um,
You've not walked the
Technical
roads all these
tests.
years for that, no?
Well, exactly. And maybe that's just me being a little bit obnoxious, but like, technical tests are a big one for me. Like I was a lead developer. I would like to think I knew my stuff, but if you put me in the interview situation and ask me to recall code, like I'm gonna look like a junior developer who hasn't got a clue. Like, and I just think I sort of understand why firms ask for them, but like there's just too, some places are doing like 3, 4 technical interviews, or go and spend 4 hours writing this full thing. And just think, well, hang on, why? Like,
Where do I have that
again,
time? And yeah.
yeah. So, and like the main one that annoys me is just recruiters reaching out and asking, "Oh, Shaun, do you want to go and be the head of HR? Where'd you get that from?" Like, I've never like, it just seems, especially on LinkedIn, it's really bad. But yeah, I mean, there's just so much improvement to be made across the board, I think, around recruitment. Like, not necessarily from a recruiter's perspective, but just like all of those systems and stuff are just like a
Yeah.
big one that I see as well is around like, so let's say you have a blind person, they go through all the way through, they get offered the job, and then we can't offer, or you can't offer them the job because your internal software just won't work with the screen reader. You've just wasted their time all the way through that process, knowing fine well you can't do it. But in the view of diversity and inclusion, you've let them go through it and only to let them down because of this thing doesn't work. So I think there's a much bigger conversation around like setting up internally. I spoke a little bit about this on LinkedIn the other day. Like firms need to start taking internal accessibility a little bit more seriously. Like the stats remain the same within your organization. Like, and you can't, it's never going to change if you don't fix it. Then you can't hire disabled people. Then it's a vicious circle, isn't it?
And you're missing out on an incredible resource there.
Yeah.
Those people with disabilities, or those that may have additional needs, are still some of the most fantastic and most amazing minds on the planet. So
Oh, yeah.
regardless of,
And
yeah, like you said, like not just your user base and the people that are going to spend money on your platform or your service or your tool or product or whatever it is, it's also, like you say, you can build better with nothing with us without us, sort of, that another quote out there, but and
yeah,
it
yeah.
has to be that representation.
But and what you have to remember as well is like a lot of people who go for accessibility jobs are disabled, neurodivergent. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of people in this space who meet that criteria, and if they're not getting the reasonable adjustments, like, well, that doesn't really set the tone for how it's going to go for the rest of their employment if like you're treating them like crap on day one. So
Yeah.
um I just think firms are getting better at it, definitely, but this, like everything, I mean, we could talk about this all day. Like, if we just still could always be improving on this stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's like standard practice. It's my responsibility, obviously, if I'm saying I'm going to focus in this space, I need to make sure that I'm getting that right and try and lead by example, and hopefully it will create competition. It will make sure that there's other recruiters in the space that are seeing that this is a viable area to make sure that we can help people find work, but also find the right talent and resources for their teams to grow this out.
Yeah.
But hopefully, yeah, if I can set an example, then that would be great. So that's why I'm asking for that advice from the likes of yourself, which is good. Um, so you mentioned earlier that you traveled to Sweden recently to deliver a talk at Nexa's accessibility event. Was it just accessibility, or was it just one of their sort of digital UX events?
Yeah. So it was just focused on accessibility. So it was people from the Swedish public sector. There was some people there from Swedish banks. Obviously, I've done both, so they were like, come and could talk about like how it's been approached in different ways.
Yeah,
It was really good actually, and it was the first. I do a lot of talks like internally and stuff, but I always feel a bit like an imposter sometimes when I'm talking, because a lot of this stuff, like everybody else talks about it. So like if I'm going to talk about something, I want to be able to bring something new to this. Like I
yeah,
don't just want to regurgitate what everybody else is saying, because it can become a little bit like that. And I read the same articles over and over again.
yeah,
So I've always sort of just put myself off doing stuff like that. But I just think, like if it's not for people like me in lead roles and like who are driving this stuff, if I'm not going to talk about it, then like, why, like,
why not? Like, yeah,
like
and who
why
is?
not
Yeah.
exactly? So I was nervous for it, but it actually went down really well. And
Oh, good.
I just think it's made us think, well, right, I'll do more of this stuff now. Like, it landed really well. And yeah.
And that's, I mean, so like those types of events, and obviously I've mentioned that I went to Accessibility Scotland, and like
Yeah.
thankfully my boss helped to sponsor the event, which was an absolute honor. Um, and it's obviously, like you say, there might be some regurgitation, there might be some repetitiveness with these events. But it's raising that awareness. You're trying to let people know the work you're currently doing, what's being done, what they can do differently. Um, there are, I think there's a quote unquote problem. I mean, it's the same with this podcast. I've got you coming on here, and you might be saying some of the stuff but the people that weren't at Nexa's event or won't be able to see that content, hopefully will be able to hear you speak here. So I think it is just churning it out and keeping it going. But
Yeah.
the problem, quote unquote, or air quotes, is that a lot of the audience or the listeners of this are people that are already aware or interested in or focused on working in the space. So it's trying to find that market. How do we grow that out? Do we need to partner with more design and product focused conferences and have an accessibility piece there? Or, you know, we need to just grow that presence, I suppose, everywhere. Because, like you said, we need people in every team, really, don't we? But
Yeah.
do you agree? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I do. I do. So, if I refer back to the start of this conversation, like, Kat McCauley was at a something that was nothing to do with accessibility, and it got me hooked. So it definitely works by doing that. I think the problem about this is that there aren't enough of us to go to the 200 conferences every year or whatever. So
Yeah,
it's hard to do, but I think like we're seeing more of it. And I think when people learn, so my friend Laura Parker, so you might know Laura, she there's a talk around dyscalculia. She was one of the people behind the posters around designing for dyscalculia. She does a lot of talks. She's a content designer by trade.
okay,
And she, has been talking about accessibility within the context of like content design and particularly around numbers and stuff. Does a brilliant job. Has been doing lots of talks at those events. So, when people realize, oh, actually, this applies to like what I do. Like we're seeing more people popping up at these events, going, oh, by the way, accessibility.
yeah,
And most people, like I would like to think that most of like tech is quite left leaning, so it's not a hard sell usually.
yeah,
So, and I suppose it's back on my previous point, like, I should probably be doing more. Like, I've got a lot of experience in this. I've pretty much done it all now. And I think there's, even if it is, regurgitating some of the stuff that people might have already said, it still goes a long way, I think, on an audience that's never heard it before. So,
yeah,
and we've all got different experiences as well. Like, and I think one of the things that always comes out in conversations I have with like other people doing this is like, we're all still doing it differently, and that's fine. Like I love to learn what other people are doing, like what's working, what didn't work.
yeah,
Like, and I think like we're good as a community at like trying to sort of come up with some standards for this, because the WCAG and all that stuff, it's very hard and complex. So
Mm.
yeah, I think we'll definitely see more of it, but definitely, I would love to see more around like training, or like I would love to see a training conference where they talk about like disabled staff and how to do training for that. Like, there's so
Yeah.
much opportunity in that space. It's just I don't think there's enough people to actually go and continuously talk about this like all summer or whenever the conference season is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, it's tricky. I think it's opening up a lot more because we can do some more fully remote conferences, things like this as well, I guess. Like, if we
Yeah.
can get some more podcasts going, I would love to see that. I know there are quite a few out there as well. I know this isn't the only one about accessibility. I'm going to do a piece on that as well because I want to do that cross promotion. I don't want people to just think, oh, it's just this one guy, doing a podcast. But I think it's it is just constantly talking about it. I think that that helps with the mindset shift. I think it helps with the culture. It helps just people just to spark that idea, like what could I be doing differently? Which brings me to the last question, um, which I've tried to ask on every episode of the podcast, and it is: what are the simplest, most cost-effective, and convenient ways that someone can implement more digital accessibility within their line of work? And don't worry, I know that we've spoken about all the different teams that need to be focusing on it, but yeah, just in
Yeah.
general.
I say so. Interestingly, actually, when I was in Sweden, there was like a break in between, and they put this poll thing on the screen, and it was um, like what are the problems that the audience were facing. So it was things like getting buy-in, going beyond compliance, developing capability, and budget. And interestingly, when we came back, I was very surprised to see this, but getting budget was the one that sort of peaked that list. And I thought it was going to be like getting buy-in or even develop capability. And this was like a winner by a country mile. And I think, you know, I mean, I can. Do you want to know how much I've spent this year on accessibility?
I would love to.
Less than £1,000. So it's, and I suppose, and by the way, I'm not saying that you don't need budget, because you do. Like,
The
I'm about to
staff and
spend four
things,
grand
yeah.
on an audit, but I think if you're just starting out and you're trying to make a case for accessibility, particularly, or even get to a strategy, let's say, you should be going out doing a gap analysis. Like, what are the problems? What are the problems that we intend to solve? Write your strategy. Like, how are you going to do this? Create some project plans. Like, there's a lot of this stuff that you can do without ever getting budget from anyone. Like, and if you're interested, that the less than £1,000 was for kit for our accessibility empathy lab.
Oh, right, yeah.
So it was just buying some equipment for that. Um, of course, you are going to need budget if you need to fix things and bring more people in and all that stuff. But I think what I'm trying to say is, like, it's not it's not a it's not going to stop you starting, almost. So you can get a long way with this stuff, and launch a champions network. Like, there's so many different things that you can get going and do a good job at before you need that.
Yeah.
But I think, like, if you are going to do this, and to answer your question again, like, think big, start small with this stuff. Like, pick what are the real problems that your customers or your people who use your service are facing, and try and get involved at the right time. Like, the earlier the better. Like, we all know this. Like, if and just if you are, start embed into as many meetings as you can. Like, when I joined Monzo, if there was a meeting, I was in it. Like,
Yeah.
I was just there talking about this stuff, right? Like, unapologetically, just waffling on about accessibility wherever I could. Like, you will be surprised at how much buy-in you can get just by doing that and getting in front of the right people.
Yeah.
Um, Champions networks, like, in this community as well, like, lean on me, lean on other people. I've had so much help from people, who work in this line of work. I don't think I would have been in the roles I'm in now if it wasn't for the likes of Craig. Like, Craig's helped me with loads of stuff. Like, an amazing guy. um and like, I'll always try and give back as well. I do mentoring with people. Like, every now and again, I'll put something out on Twitter, say, like, I'll mentor some people. I've got a few going now. I'll do catch ups with, like, other people who work in the line of work, and I just think, like, we can solve things together. Like, don't feel like you need to do this by yourself, because this community is, like, brilliant. And you can get a long way without having to worry about, oh my god, I need like £3 million to do this like amazing stuff. If it's done at the right time, you technically don't really need any money. Like, it's only when they do it at the end and it's all broken, then you need to go and fix it. All right, okay, that'll be like 6 million. So
Yeah. And it
yeah,
is, you're so right. I think it's such a friendly and welcoming environment. And I feel that, like you say, doing that, gap analysis at the beginning, just sort of understanding what the problems might actually be that people encounter, or if you've got problems yourself, it might even help to gain that buy-in, because you're like, well, I can't actually access this system that we work with because it doesn't work for me. So
exactly. And there's like one question as well. Like, if you were, implementing anything into your work, whatever it is you're doing, just think while you're doing it, who might I be excluding by doing this thing? Like,
yeah,
that one question will make you think, right, okay, well, I've just written this 70 paragraph thing, right? Well, that's immediately going to be people with dyslexia, ADHD. Like, just by thinking in that way, you will notice that you improve your work and make it more accessible by default, just by thinking, actually, like, this might not work for this person.
yeah, absolutely. And it's just, yeah, alt text, all sorts of stuff. And I know that I've not, in this podcast series, I've not introduced myself and described myself, or our guests and things, which I should really be doing. But I suppose because it is such a audio only, I know we have the YouTube for the visual and the transcript as well. But I feel like if people are just listening to this on audio, they don't really necessarily need to know what we look like. However, if people are interested, then I'm more than happy to start doing that. So I guess that'll be something I'll put out there if people would like descriptions of people that are joining us on the podcast. But cool. So I guess we've come to the end of the sort of formal questions. So if there's anything that's of real importance to you at the moment, are there any talks coming up, or what you're doing at the moment at Monzo? If you'd like to share that with everyone, then that would be great.
Yeah, so I'm going to be going back to Sweden in November. Nexa have kindly asked me to go back, so I'm like really buzzing with that. Get to go to Gothenburg, which would be good.
Amazing.
Um, I've managed to get a really big gig next year that I can't really talk about yet, but that'll be coming soon. I'm always doing mentoring, trying to help people where I can. Like, if you're on LinkedIn, Twitter, any of that stuff, and you need help with this, like, or you just want to sound off, like, you know, drop a message. And the last thing that I'm working on as well is we've just started recording a podcast with Jamie and Lion,
Oh wow.
Jamie Knight, which is going to be really fun, cool. Jamie is a brilliant character. I love spending time with him. And that's going to be around like monotropism and tunnels and not tasks. So
Oh, wow.
one to look out for if you're interested in the neurodivergent content.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that just sounds incredible. And Jamie is such an incredible person to speak to. Um,
Yeah.
there's been on and off talks with Jamie over the years of asking him to come on this, but I kind of felt that imposter syndrome, because he's got, is it 1800 seconds of autism? There was something he'd done with BBC
Oh
Sounds
yeah, he's
before.
done. Yeah.
I just thought, I can't compete. I'm not going to ask him again. I'm just going to sort of leave it. But we'll maybe approach that another time. Maybe we could get a panel or something
Honestly,
together.
do it. Jamie is a lovely, lovely human, and he's just amazing to spend time with. So I'm almost certain that he would come and talk to you on this.
He's a lovely, lovely man. Yeah, I'll definitely get back in touch. But that's brilliant. So cool. So to finish each episode with a quote centered around accessibility, which is what I like to do, and it's actually something that I actually heard on ID24, the 2023 conference has just finished, and Neil Jarvis said, depending on which measure you use and which country you're considering, anything between 1 in 4, 1 in 5, or 1 in 6 people would count themselves as having a disability. That's a lot of people to close the door on. There's a strong economic reason for not blocking access to potentially a quarter of your users. And that's just, it just sort of in a nutshell tells you from that perspective, if it's not the empathy side, if it's from a business perspective, think of your users. You could be, increasing by 25% by doing this stuff. But thank you again so much for joining me, Shaun, and it's been an absolute pleasure. It's always a pleasure speaking to you, and yeah, really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend this last hour with me, and hope you've enjoyed the chat as much as I have.
Yeah, It's been good. Thank you very much for having us.
No problem, and I'm sure we'll stay in touch. I'll get all of your your LinkedIn and your Twitter and stuff posted as links alongside the podcast. So if anyone wants to get in touch with you, I'll direct them there. But I'll double check which ones you want me to use first before posting them, in case people start calling you at lunchtime every day.
That's all right.
But brilliant. Thank you again so much, Shaun, and yeah, take care.
No worries.
Another huge thank you to Shaun for joining me on this episode. Hope you found that as insightful as I did. As mentioned, I'll make sure that links are provided for our LinkedIn and Twitter profiles for you to reach out with any comments or feedback. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.